So welcome to today's digital conference on digital and trade, a path to better market opportunities and employment creation. So I am Amadou Sako, advisor and project officer for Africa at the International Organization of Employer, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this event. As your moderator, I will be guiding this discussion, making sure everyone has a chance to participate and ensuring that we stay on the topic. Before we get started, I want to go over some instruction for the audience. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function to communicate with me or the panelists. We will have a Q&A session to give a chance to the panelists to respond to any question or react to any comments the audience might have. I want to thank our esteemed panel of speakers for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. We have an exciting and informative topic to discuss, and I look forward to a productive and engaging conversation. So let's get started. For the opening remarks, I will now call on the floor Mr. Roberto Soares Santos, IOE Secretary General.
Well, thank you, Amadou. It's again a pleasure to be with all of you here. This is not the first discussion we have on the topic of trade and employment. This is a trend that we started already, we launched the initiative already more than 1 year ago on trade and employment, working with different international organizations, but of course with dialogue with the WTO, with UNCTAD, and other important business organizations like BusinessMed also, who is joining us. Let me just stress in some, I think, relevant points that we know, but sometimes we are not so much aware of how important they are transforming our economies, our business, our workplace. Digitalization, what we call digitalization, has, and nobody can deny it, a profound impact in our daily lives, but also on employment and also on trade, transforming the way we conduct business, transforming the way we work, transforming also we do cross-border trade. The rise of e-commerce, cloud computing, and other digital technologies has enabled business of all sizes, and that's a very important point, how I wouldn't call it democratization of access to markets, but it has enabled small and medium companies, startups, to get a global outreach that they didn't have before. As a result, the digital economy has created, let's say, a kind of new market, improving the efficiency, reducing costs, but also raising important challenges that goes from payment systems to also employment issues. At the same time, as I said, digitalization transformed the world of work, the place we work, the concept of workplace, but also the concept, to some extent, also working time, as a consequence, has also been influenced by digitalization itself. Let me just give you some figures. The COVID pandemic has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies. Right now, according to a recent survey of WTO, 65% of business have reported to increase the use of digital technology for trade during the pandemic. According to McKinsey, top economic performers during the crisis have invested time and resources to produce entirely new digital offerings by 46%, compared to the non-top performers, 28%, which did not produce new digital offerings. Meaning by that those who embrace digital tools, those also who had good connectivity, because that's also an issue, those who had also good digital skills had much more chances to be successful as business. This trend was also before the pandemic. The use of digital platforms for trading services had increased already by 45% between 2015 and 2020, according to the WTO. But as I said, these new practices, these new opportunities also come with challenges. One of the most significant challenges is regulations. And we do not want to hide that there are challenges regarding regulations. Business needs certainty. Business needs legal certainty. One of these regulatory challenges is the ongoing discussion on the status quo of the moratorium and work program on electric commerce in order to foster e-commerce by maintaining the current practice of not imposing custom duties on electronic transactions. Some member states, important producers of tech-related services, have been demanding for many years the end of this moratorium in order to increase the fiscal revenues. But of course, that have consequences. And that's a debate, and that's a challenge that needs to be overcome. The sooner, the better. We could say that digital trade regulations, but also in international frameworks, when we talk about digital, and also governance systems are still at their early stages, even though digitalization has already an important trend of more than 10 years. And that can lead also to some inconsistencies across jurisdictions. And even though the digitalization pace has increased, it can pose significant risk to the way business engage in this trend, but also the way individuals and workers also engage in this trend. Furthermore, and that's where IOE has developed an important expertise, we consider the impact of digitalization on employment as huge. Digitalization has created, and we are discussing now in the ILO, the future of the platform economy in its work consequences, in its employment consequences. But digitalization on one side has able to create new jobs, new kind of jobs, but for providing that there are the right skills, the right digital skills, which are not always there. We are talking about new professions like data analysis, software development, cybersecurity, but we also are talking about basic digital skills. And it has also led to the automation of many tasks. And we had many concerns, many fears already in 2019 when we were discussing the future work, on to what extent jobs will be destroyed and other jobs will be created. And the evidence is telling us that the job destruction is not such a huge trend by now, even though there are important risks. And what is most important is that we need these good transitions, effective transitions from some sectors, some industries, on manufacturing and logistics to others, and also within the same sector to a more digital way of working. So this skills debate is not absent, should not be absent in the discussion on digital trade and employment. And that's where IOE comes in. We want to play a critical role contributing to shaping the future of work by advocating for policies that are the right ones, that support on one side business growth, job creation, and skills development. And also preserve the fundamental rights that need to be preserved to have a fair playground. So those are the elements where we want to have and frame this discussion. And for this session, we have incredible good panelists. We have, and Mamadou will refer to them, but we have Mrs. Hiro Shirotori. Thank you for being here, officer in charge of UNCTAD in the Division of International Trade and Commodities. We have Manuela Tomei, Assistant Director General for Governance, Rights and Dialogue and the International Labour Organization, and also she's helping us on an important discussion on the platform economy and employment and work-related rights in the ILO. We have Mrs. Sulina Abdullah, a Special Advisor of ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. We have Philip O'Reilly. He was the former chairman of business at the OECD, BIAC, but also he has been very much helping us also to have also this initiative on trade and employment developed. And also we have Mrs. Jihen Butiba, Executive Director or EPSOMED and Secretary General of BusinessMed. So I will be listening to you, learning also from you, but more importantly, we will be following up this discussion with important action with our entire membership in IOE. Thank you very much for listening. And Amadou, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this introductory remark. As Roberto has mentioned, digitalization has had a profound impact on trade, and it's also bringing many challenges globally. And who better than UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UN intergovernmental organization within the UN Secretariat that promotes the interest of developing countries in world trade, to tell us more about trade today and digitalization. So we have the honor to have with us Mrs. Mio Shirotori, officer in charge of the Division on International Trade and Commodities. And Mrs. Shuatori, I have this question for you today. It's what is the state of play and how digitalization is changing trade according to UNCTAD? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think Secretary General Suarez is, setting the scene was perfect. I think it covered everything that is important. But thank you, first of all, for inviting the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And it's a great pleasure to speak at this important event on behalf of the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan. So I'd like to address how digitalization is changing trade, but with a specific focus on trade in services. And I'd like to design my intervention in 3 points. First, looking at the opportunities. Second, the challenges. And the third, the needed cooperation related to digital trade in services. So my first point is about the opportunities in digital trade in services. What do we mean? Many services, such as financial services, insurance, sales and marketing, research and development, education services, and even health services have become digitally deliverable to foreign consumers as to local users. So the magnitude is quite significant. In 2021, the global exports of digital trade in services reached $3.8 trillion, and they accounted for over 65% of total services exports. It's not only developed countries which are dominating this scene. Developing countries' export of digital services have been increasing fast at an annual rate of 7% between 2014 and 2021. With this, employment opportunities are growing for digital marketing, logistics, social media, technical solutions, digital payments, and data processing experts. And in particular, we are also focusing on the fact that jobs are being created in large numbers in the so-called creative economy, in which developing countries have a huge comparative advantage. Now, creative economy on new digital products like software, video games, and the delivery of creative contents to consumers via a greater range of media such as video on demand, music, podcasting, and streaming, and so on and so forth. So what we are saying is that it's not only the services, digital services is a new destination economic sector to diversify into, but also that capacity to participate in digital services trade has become a necessary ingredient or sine qua non to participate in international merchandise trade. My second point now is the challenges we face in achieving inclusiveness in digital trade. Despite all its current and political potential benefits, the digital economy remains highly unequal. While more than 80% of internet users in Europe shop online today, fewer than 10% do so in most least developed countries. Now, digital divide is pushing many low-income countries outside of digital services, and not being able to participate in digital services trade prevents farm in low-income countries from reaching the global market, which risks their future earning potentials. We also highlight the fact that digital services trade is predominantly managed by businesses in the OECD countries. And I must highlight our concerns that trade in digital services can be fraught with anti-competitive and unfair business practices. Dominant online platforms serve as gatekeepers, and they set the rules of the game for market access and interaction between consumers, business users, and service providers. So what does it mean? If these trends continue unabated, digitalization may create a core periphery dynamic in the global trade landscape, and it will harm small businesses and consumers all over the world, but particularly in lower income countries. Against this, my third and final point is about cooperation. We must cooperate to make digital trade work for sustainable and inclusive economic and employment growth. But policy coordination among government and UN agencies would not be enough. We need the stakeholders in the business sector to work together for this purpose. In this context, let me share with you some examples of how the UN agencies like UNCTAD are trying to come up with a multi-stakeholder solution to today's uneven and at times very unfair development of digital trade, particularly in digital services trade. Through its intergovernmental group of experts, UNCTAD works to bring competition policy and consumer protection policy to digital markets so that the markets work for all with a level playing field between big and small businesses and with a safe and trustworthy environment for consumers to attend to their needs and wishes. UNCTAD also provides a platform for countries to share their experiences and initiatives to harness opportunities in services trade, including digital services trade, through its multi-year expert meeting on trade services and development. Last but not least, the member states of UNCTAD are discussing frameworks for assessing the digital trade in terms of its employment and income earning opportunities with a specific focus on gender equality. And we are very happy. I'm very happy to discuss further on these issues. Now, distinguished participants, to conclude, I really would like to commend the International Organization of Employers for its vision and mission to create a sustainable economic environment worldwide, promoting free enterprise that is fair and beneficial to both business and society. It is more important than ever to have multi-stakeholder cooperation to tackle development challenges in the new economic landscape presented by digitalization. We at UNCTAD, as a UN agency, hope to continue working with IOE to make digital trade contribute to sustainable and inclusive future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Shiratori, for this very insightful intervention that outlined the opportunities, challenges, and what is needed when it comes to trade, especially digital trade in services. I note that there is a need for international cooperation in order to have at the global level a balance when it comes to digitalization. Now, let's go to our next speaker, Mrs. Manuela Tome from the International Labour Organization, the UN agency whose mandate is to advocate for social justice. And the International Labour Organization takes care of everything that is related to the employment. And the IOE and the ILO are closely related, as the IOE was created over 100 years ago to coordinate employers' participation within the International Labour Organization. Mrs. Tome, the ILO new Director General has recently proposed to forge a global coalition for social justice, bringing together the ILO tripartite constituents and organizations from the multilateral system, as well as other stakeholders. What is the foreseen role for multilateral trade organization in this coalition, and why is their involvement important?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. And thank you also very much for inviting the ILO to attend this very topical and timely event. Let me address your question by explaining first why the ILO has decided to launch a coalition on social justice. Social progress has slid back as a result of the impact of COVID, natural disasters, geopolitical turmoil, and high inflation. Millions who had escaped poverty are now back below the poverty line. Many poor households are taking on more and more debt as inflation drives food and energy prices up. About 290 million youth globally are not in education, employment, or training, with young women faring much worse than their male peers. And globally, we still have a deficit of hours work that is the equivalent of 40 million full-time jobs compared with the last quarter of 2019. In many emerging economies, employment recovery is driven by recovery in informal employment. And as it has already highlighted by the previous speakers, high skills occupations have experienced some employment recovery, but employment in low and medium skilled occupations remain below pre-crisis level. Enterprises have been hard hit, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, and many had to stop operations as they couldn't cope with the unexpected and cumulative events. Global trade also contracted over the last 3 years, with the employment impact of this contraction being especially severe in developing countries and notably in labor-intensive traded sectors. So against this background, and as DG Hombo says, the world needs a strong and sustained dose of social justice. And what does this mean for us at the ILO? It means prioritizing social justice and decent work, together with increased investments in social and economic policies built on social dialogue. Employment policies, including skills enhancement policies, social protection, a policy environment that enables enterprises of all sizes to stay viable in an increasingly complex global economy, together with international labor standards, are key to advancing decent work. So let me now address the other part of your question regarding why the involvement of the multilateral system in this coalition is important. The answer is very simple. Delivering on decent work also requires access to social and digital infrastructure, as well as access to food or a safe and clean environment, and vice versa. No single actor or policy measure can alone deliver social justice, whether nationally or globally. And this is what the Global Coalition is all about. It seeks to bring together the ILO tripartite constituents and the business, the organizations of employers and the business communities are very much part of the ILO's constituency, and the relevant multilateral organizations, including, of course, trade organizations. The main purpose is to enhance cooperation to deliver a coherent multilateral response to the world's socioeconomic problems and promote increased financing to close the gaps towards the achievement of the SDGs, including SDG 8. So why is the involvement of the multilateral trade organizations important? Well, the benefits of trade as an engine of growth and prosperity are well documented. I don't need to elaborate on them, but for attaining SDG 8 goals, trade must be crafted in ways that it will drive inclusive growth and employment and generate decent jobs, where worker rights are respected and unfair competition in a global labor market is curbed. And Ms. Shirotori spoke about how digitalization is changing trade. And, and we must also speak about how these changes are impacting workers and enterprises, especially micro and SMEs, to inform policies, to liberalize, regulate, and condition digital trade accordingly. And I would just like to highlight a few such impacts, which were alluded to also in part by Ms. Shirotori. There are certainly impacts in terms of skill bias and labor market frictions. Advances in digital economy have allowed more and more services to be performed by workers in cross-border locations. There is likely to be a skill bias to these changing trade patterns, resulting in an increase in the demand for higher skilled workers in emerging economies, as services tend to be more skill intensive than agriculture and manufacturing. The shift from physically based goods to digital goods and services is also likely to cause dislocation of and redundancies in traditional brick and mortar industries, but the ease of moving across sectors might prove difficult, with younger workers and highly educated workers more likely to benefit over older workers or lowly educated ones. Job creation is also likely to be biased towards urban areas with the requisite infrastructure and ecosystems. Unless carefully designed adjustment policies are adopted, the increase in services trade could lead to increased unemployment and greater wage inequality, as many workers are unable to transition smoothly between sectors and occupations. And let me also refer to another issue which relates to the fact that an increase in digital trade may raise issues relating to data protection, privacy, and algorithmic transparency. And these issues are going to become even more important in the future, and also with the rise in digital trade. So some concerns have been expressed in this regard, including more recently in a meeting of experts that took place in the ILO recently. What can we done? Certainly, digital trade chapters in digital trade agreements could recognize and address these issues. With regard to what we could do together with the trade organizations, so we have already been working together. Over the past 15 years, we have conducted joint research, for instance, with WTO on trade and employment, on trade and informality and skills. And we are currently discussing about extending our joint research to trade and gender. With UNCTAD, we have been cooperating on employment impact assessment models, and more recently have engaged on trade and macroeconomic and industrial policies. And with the WTO International Trade Center, cooperation has focused on export diversification and employment. So this is good, but we need to do more together. And where more action is needed, for instance, is with respect to rethinking and retooling policy instruments such as trade policy to address both economic and social benefits. Examples include aid for trade. It has mainly focused on supply side capacity and trade-related infrastructure constraints, particularly for MSMEs. A focus also on workers and labor market institutions such as skills training, social protection, and meaningful social dialogue that can mitigate trade risk would be welcome. At the same time, labor provisions in trade agreements have shown that they help level the playing field, reduce trade costs, facilitate trade, and for greater effectiveness, we need to also strengthen cooperation and financing to support labor market institutions that ensure compliance with international labor standards in the trade context. So to conclude, the reasons for trade organization to join forces with the ILO, the private sector, the labor movement, and other actors would be to better support trade, to increase living standards, create decent jobs, support SMEs in particular, and benefit all people. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tomé, for your intervention that gives us a better understanding of the link between trade, digital trade, and employment. You've raised the importance, you've mentioned the importance of international cooperation. You've also raised the important point of data, which we will discuss a bit later during this event. You've mentioned that social justice requires access to social and digital infrastructure. And this leads us to our next speaker from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, which is the UN agency specialized in ICT-related matters. And we have with us today Mrs. Sulina Abdullah, the special advisor at the ITU. And Mrs. Abdullah, the ITU is committed to connecting the world. So what should governments across the world do regarding digital regulatory environment and digital infrastructures to foster digital trade? The floor is yours, Mrs. Abdullah.
Thank you, Amadou, and hello, Roberto. It's good to see you, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, today, anyone and everyone who can be connected is already connected. Not just connected, but on multiple devices. Now, I will admit to being connected to 5 devices at any one time, and I'm willing to bet that many of you are too. But yet, there are still billions of people in the world who are offline and not participating in the digital economy. Millions more who are connected, but they can't always do what they want online whenever they need to. Next slide, please. Just give me 1 second. I think it's 1 slide back. In the next few minutes, I will try to take you through these 4 areas to give you an indication of where we stand on each and what needs to be done from our perspective so as to foster digital trade. Next, please. Why is regulation important in this area? Because broadband has had a significant impact on the world economy in the last 8 years. And ITU studies have shown that an increase in broadband penetration leads to an increase in GDP. And what you see on screen are global figures. Next, please. Countries and regions have made global and regional commitments to open their telecoms and ICT markets to foster trade. And I think you know this a lot better than we do. And these commitments have resulted in best practices and providing investors with the predictability that they need to continue investing, among others. Next. Between 1997 and 2002, WTO members made some basic commitments. The reference paper contains 6 basic obligations based on the principles of objectivity, timeliness, transparency, being non-discriminatory and competitively neutral. And governments were kept busy reforming the telecom sector to establish independent regulators, promote competition, interconnection, licensing frameworks which were technology neutral, universal service, and allocation and assignment of scarce resources. How quickly they achieved all that depended upon whether they had clear mandates, the political will, and much needed resources. The quicker they achieved the reform, the faster they reaped the benefits. And please remember this slide as I will turn to it again in a few minutes. Next, please. Today, governments are focusing on digital transformation for development and sustainability. And what's important on this slide is the reference to universal and meaningful connectivity. And that's the concept of a user being able to do anything she or he wants online, whenever he or she needs to. And today, universal connectivity alone is not sufficient. It has to be meaningful. Next. ITU's approach to digital transformation is based on the tried and tested formula of access, adoption, and value creation, spread over 10 building blocks. One is on the legal, policy, and regulatory framework, another on connectivity and digital infrastructure. There is a 6-step approach to the wheel, beginning with a diagnostic assessment on a country or a region based on 200+ indicators. Next. ITU has been investing in regulation for the past 2 decades or so. And we have what we call the 5 generations of regulation. It's a tool that regulators can refer to see where they stand in terms of their regulatory framework. G5 is about digital regulation. It focuses on 3 important elements: an expanded scope, tracking shift from ICT to the digital economy, the level of collaborative digital regulation across agencies, and the need for governments to develop a digital economy policy agenda. Next. So back to the earlier slide. Many of the issues in the reference paper have not changed. But today, in the digital environment, and with that growing digital economy, what you see in bold is what is needed in addition to what was needed then. A digital regulator, consumer protection, as mentioned before, which is challenging across borders, seamlessness so that anyone can make a digital transaction from anywhere in the world to anywhere else, a light-handed licensing approach to foster innovation, innovative financing, optimized allocation of resources needed more than ever. Now, key elements for success: collaborative mechanisms, whole of government approach, skilling, upskilling, and reskilling. And the impact is clear. Increased investment in digital infrastructure, greater adoption and value creation, growth of local companies and entrepreneurs in a market which has no borders, and overall digital ecosystem growth. Next. ITU estimates 2.7 billion people are offline in the world today. But why? The finger is often pointed at infra or the lack of it, but is this really the case? Next. This slide shows you a regional comparison of infrastructure indicators based on our wheel, and I will leave this with you. Next, please. So back to the finger pointing. Is digital infra the choke point? ITU studies show that 95% of the world's population now has access to a mobile broadband network. Those who are not connected, and this was mentioned before, lack affordability, the awareness of the need for the internet, and/or the skills to access and make the most of apps and services. And there are those millions who are connected, but not meaningfully, because connectivity is either too slow, unreliable, or costly, or they too lack the digital skills. So in a nutshell, the answer is yes. Digital infra remains a challenge for universal and meaningful connectivity, but there are other challenges too. Next. When a nation and its citizens are so reliant on digital for trade, health, education, agriculture, and the like, the more it is that governments need to make sure that communication services work all the time. And digital resilience is the key to that. And that includes physical infra, physical and cyber security, content, including disinformation, data governance and privacy, skills, business continuity. Next. In 2020, the economic cost of security breaches reached $4 to $6 trillion, and that's roughly 4 to 6% of global GDP. In 2022, the average cost of a data breach globally hit $4.35 million. In terms of comms traffic, over 95% of the internet network runs through submarine cables. There are 1.3 million kilometers of subsea cables, and that's over 3 times the distance from Earth to Moon. On average, there are over 100 breaks of submarine cables every year. And if you need to know the location of submarine cables, just Google it. Anyone can find a map of subsea cables. Over the last 50 years, the number of global natural disasters per year has multiplied more than 5 times. And according to a 2022 IBM report, 60% of organizations' breaches led to increases in prices passed on to customers. 79% of critical infrastructure organizations did not deploy a zero trust architecture. One cable cut in June last year plunged millions of people offline and led to a temporary internet blackout. The impact was immediate. It affected 7 countries. Ethiopia lost 90% of its connectivity, Somalia 85%. Cloud services belonging to Google, Amazon, Microsoft were disrupted. Connectivity was restored in a few hours, but the disruption highlights how fragile these subsea cables are. Every ship is a risk to these cables, and that's just cables. What about the satellites? There are 5,400 in orbit, and over 2,500 are anticipated to be launched on average every year from now to 2031. That's roughly 7 per day, and ITU will be kept busy helping to park all these birds in space. Decommissioned birds are still in space. Out of the 5,000 plus, approximately 50% are active and 50% decommissioned. If any of these decommissioned birds bump into a live one, they could cause massive disruptions to satellite services. The more digital the world is, the more people we succeed in connecting, the more vulnerable we are to connectivity disruptions. And that's why governments need to pay more attention to digital resilience. You can see on screen what needs to be done. And what we all need are frameworks and mechanisms, as well as modes of engagement to enhance collaboration. Next. To conclude, there is no silver bullet, but countries need to adapt according to national priorities. As the speakers before me said, digitalization is impacting everything, more so following pandemic days. And with all things being equal, all of the above is likely to foster digital trade. Thank you, Amadou. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Mrs. Abdullah. Yes, you did answer my question. Thank you very much for your intervention. that gives us a clear picture of the ITU's approach when it comes to regulatory frameworks on infrastructures. I note that 2.7 billion people in the world are currently offline. And you talked about meaningfully connected. This is really, this came to my attention because, as I've mentioned earlier, I'm the advisor for Africa, and I'm myself from Africa, which is one of the regions of the world which is the less connected. But people don't always realize also that not only that people are not connected, but they're not meaningfully connected. And this is a very, very important concept. Thank you very much. So we will now go to our next speaker, but before that, I would just like to remind the attendees that they can directly ask questions in the chat box. We will have, after the intervention, a Q&A session based on your different questions. So we'll now go to our next speaker, Mr. Phil O'Reilly, former chairman of Business OECD and managing partner at Iron Duke. So one of business at OECD objectives is to promote competitive economies and better business for a sustainable future. And so the cross-border flow of data refers to the movement of digital information across national borders. This phenomenon has become increasingly important in today's globalized economy, where data is an essential resource for businesses, governments, and individuals. My question for you today, Mr. O'Reilly, is that since digital trade has become a fundamental factor in the development of global economy, as our previous speaker has outlined, what is the role and importance of cross-border flow of data as an horizontal principle to create a global level playing field? The floor is yours, Mr. O'Reilly.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to Roberto and the IOE team for putting this conversation together, and also thanks and regards to the other panelists. I'm looking forward. It's a great discussion already. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. From a business point of view, it's already the case that you can't really separate digital and trade. For they're both nowadays one and the same. I don't think, even if you think about trade in good old-fashioned goods, that doesn't really happen these days without digital support, a warranty claim, a bill of lading, a customs declaration, whatever it might be. Often, I can't think of anything these days that doesn't have a digital component, and therefore digital and trade are really one and the same. And I think we should think about it in that way. So in that context, when we think about digital, it's vital for jobs and for high quality jobs. We've heard some of the speakers talk about that already. We all know that jobs in sectors that are trade exposed and that are globalizing are usually more highly paid and often more secure than those that aren't trade exposed. So digital and trade also matters for high quality jobs. And the speakers, as I say before me, have made some of those points very, 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 very effectively. But there are some aspects of digital trade that it's valuable to understand a little different to normal trade, if you like, to goods and services trade that we always think about from the 20th and early 21st century. The first is that the proportion of digital services, the providers of data services themselves often account for a large proportion of data usage, telecoms, data processing, web portal services, and so on. The second aspect is that data often flows between affiliates of multinational corporations, including things like financial planning, human resources and administration, bookkeeping, financial services, and so on. So in this context, when we talk about digital trade, it's not quite the same as New Zealand selling the UK some good old-fashioned lamb. This is much more about the interplay of providers and multinational corporations doing business in new ways that the world has come to value. And that the importance in that context of cross-border trade is amplified. Digital trade is happening all the time between a lot more borders, at a lot of pace, and a lot more detailed level than previously was the case. And therefore, trade restrictiveness around digital becomes a really critical issue for business. And the international business community and national business organizations have been talking about that for some years now, including my organization, my old organization, Business at OECD, but also the IOE and others too. Forced data localization and digital protectionism of one sort or another are a real concern, more particularly when we see those kinds of data flows that we already talked about a few minutes ago. Forced data localization doesn't necessarily actually help domestic industries, but serves to just make it harder for those countries that are subject to it to develop. It's a truism of all trade protectionism, but it's particularly true of digital, that protectionism tends to hurt the least developed economies. It tends to make it harder for them to develop and to become wealthy. And we've heard that particularly from UNCTAD a few minutes ago, that in fact, it's the richer countries that tend to be more problematic in these areas, as well as other areas that are not necessarily particularly digitally based. So making sure that digital trade is free and flows more easily is a key part of our efforts towards the Sustainable Development Goals, to provide decent work and higher quality jobs and more prosperous communities. How can we improve matters about making sure that digital happens better across borders? The first point I'd make is there is an important need to review and modernise the WTO rules and procedures to ensure they're fit for the digital age. The business community was relieved with the latest negotiations at the WTO, which saw the extension of a moratorium on creating new tariffs on digital, which Roberto's referred to, but that's nowhere near enough. We need to make sure that the rules-based system, trading system through the WTO enables digital trade flows for all of the reasons I've outlined above. Increasingly, you can't have prosperity without these digital trade flows. The second theme I'd raise is that of building trust. Data access and sharing have become central drivers of economic growth and social well-being. We'll all know that when we click on a new app, we'll be asked to share some information, and we agree to that or not. But that central driver of economic growth and social well-being, because it's become so integral a part of many economies, it also can, of course, create concerns about cross-border data flows, and that's been amplified in the context of governments, businesses and citizens occasionally eroding trust in digital because of those kinds of security and privacy concerns. Sometimes cross-border data flows are restricted in the name of safeguarding privacy of individuals, for example, or protecting information deemed to be sensitive from a security perspective. And sometimes they're used to improve, according to the governments, developing countries' domestic capability in digitally intensive sectors. The first two of those list of three, in my view, are sometimes arguable and appropriate. In other words, protecting individual privacy and national security concerns. But even they are often used inappropriately and as a form of protectionism. They lead to an increase in regulation, and they lead to an increase in uncertainty. And as a result, they create additional costs and operational complexity and uncertainty for businesses. So establishing trust and advancing that trust to facilitate data sharing domestically and cross-border is important. The concept then of a data free flow with trust. Creating that trust is very difficult because countries maintain different policies and regulatory approaches in relation to data and cross-border data flows. But beyond those differences, which will of course be inevitable, countries can build on commonalities and elements of convergence in their approaches. They could, for example, ensure commonalities between different elements. They could work on bilateral or multilateral agreements to enable data flow. They could use enabling regulation around cross-border data flow to underpin domestic regulation. And they could ensure intergovernmental arrangements and trade agreements also refer to the importance of trust and free flow of data in that context. This whole area of building trust and enabling cross-border data flows through that needs, in my view, to be led by governments. They, at the end of the day, need to make sure that regulations are fit for purpose to ensure that sensible and appropriate personal privacy and national security concerns are addressed, while at the same time enhancing and celebrating the idea that cross-border digital data flows are incredibly important for building wealth prosperity and better jobs in economies, no matter their stage of development. There's another critical point to understanding digital trade and the growth of digital more generally, and the capacity that it has to create more and better jobs. One of the most exciting things that I personally think about when I go into this space is the capacity for least developed countries and developing economies to leapfrog the 20th century technological underpinnings of trade that developed economies have generally had and will have to replace over the next few decades. The best example for me is the old poles and wires that we use in developed economies to move data around. And in fact, least developed economies and those just starting out on this journey can actually leapfrog that technology. They don't need that anymore to the same extent to move forward on trade. That's an exciting prospect, I think. The idea that we can use digital as a way of enabling least developed and developing economies to leapfrog the old ways of doing things. Another example of this is that I can't think of a much better tool to battle corruption than the use of digital. Digital is one of those things that enables you to really to make sure that you're dealing with the right person, that you're getting paid the right amount, and so on. So digital is also not just a trade issue. It's a matter of building fairer and more just societies. And governments need to think about it in that way. This isn't just a trade issue. This is also an issue of enablement and prosperity. Businesses also have a role to play, of course. They need to build trust in the communities that they serve and amongst them between each other. A lack of trust in cross-border data flows can just as easily be affected by a business acting illegally or inappropriately, just as much as governments passing silly laws. At the end of the day, this is all about creating high-quality jobs and prosperous communities, and digital is just one way of doing that, but it's a very, very powerful way. We need to celebrate it in that context, that digital is a way of creating prosperity, it's a way of creating high-quality jobs. And if we do that and enable as much prosperity as possible, then we need to make sure that we enable cross-border data flows, and we need to build trust in those data flows to enable the social license of those businesses and those regulations to operate. On that basis, we should celebrate digital trade as a key part of just what we know as trade today. Thanks, Roberto.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Reilly. In summary, what we understand is that this challenge of cross-border data flow management, it arises from the fact that often they're subject to different laws, regulations in different countries, and this can create obstacle to the free flow of information, which can be detrimental to businesses that rely on data, and that governments, they have a key role to play to make sure that the regulation are fit for purposes, as you mentioned. You've also talked about the importance of digitalization, even beyond trade, as a powerful tool to contribute to a better society. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Reilly. We will now go to our last speaker, but not the least, Mrs. Jeanne Boutiba, the Executive Director of EBSOMED and Secretary General of BusinessMed. So BusinessMed is the organization in charge of coordinating 23 employers confederation, and as BusinessMed mission is to promote foreign direct investment and socioeconomic integration in the Mediterranean region. So we've talked a lot about regulation. Now let's talk about something very concrete. Mrs. Boutiba, BusinessMed recently launched the Business Country Desk, the BCD. Can you please tell us more about these initiatives and the result obtained so far? The floor is yours, Mrs. Boutiba.
Hi, thank you all for the invitation. Thank you for the IOE. Hopefully the sound is good. Great to see that we have some partner that we just saw in the previous meeting with the International Trade Center, with also the UNCTAD and the ILO. They were all present, and also that we heard that the thematic of digitalization and trade is starting to become very important in the region, in whatever in the world. So again, thanks to IO for the invitation. So as Amadou said, the BusinessMed is the Euro-Mediterranean Employers Organization. We gather more than 20 countries, members of the organization. So thanks also for the opportunity to share our voices and the experience we had in the ground about the twins trade and digitalization with a concrete case that we have implemented from our side. So the business country desk has been imagined in 2006 by the Euro-Mediterranean Employers Organization from our members, BusinessMed, and through the regional project EPSOMED, which is co-financed by the European Commission and on enhancing business support organization, we decided to create these platforms. So at the beginning, it was just to have a focal point in each employers organization to share this internationalization and trade between the employers organization from South and North Mediterranean. And then we have decided to create this platform in 2017. It was right before the COVID. So now more than ever, I think this is the kind of instrument we need for internationalization and trade to follow the move, particularly in the MENA region. So a part, of course, of our work that we also need a strong social dialogue as expressed by our previous partner. And this cannot come without the others. I mean, trade and digitalization cannot come without public reform, without trade agreements, without involving all multi-stakeholders, as well as international organizations we work with, NGOs, civil society, public and private sectors. So this is for us the tool that bring the voice to the government. And this is the tool we implement also the action for startup, for SMEs, for MSMEs. This is not something that's in real, this is something that we used. So I will just go directly through presenting the platform. So this is a digital portal in order to boost regional economic development in the Euro-Mediterranean region. So besides, it confirms the business community, companies, SMEs, startups, a unique opportunity to undertake sustainable business partnership with their peers operating across the Euro-Mediterranean and the MENA region, as well as in several countries in Africa. So the business country desk platform permits to do med business help desk, which is helping. For the moment, we are working in 10 countries in the MENA region, but we are intending to extend the regulations. So we offer trade guide, investment guide, country statistics for the SMEs, the business support organization, the international organization that are using the tool. Also, which is important, a partnership section. Here again, I insist on the part of multi-stakeholder approach, because usually what we notice is that each one is working by itself, and we need to gather all our initiatives together. That's why we also saw that there is a lot of business from each employers organization. For example, in Morocco, they have their own platform, in Tunisia, in Italy. So we decided to gather a unique platform, a unique path for all this business community. So the partnership section is important. And of course, the Euro-Mediterranean business matching. And this is the tool that matches the B2Bs, that organize events, that print badges and tell you, for example, if you have a meeting with this SMEs or the others with a perfect schedule. So novately, we are currently developing a new service, which is the e-learning module that will host online courses on how to also capitalize on project designing and knowledge transfer from business support organization and particularly from employers organization. So the business country desk was officially launched during our Med Business Days that we annually do. It was last year in September in Malta. And we used the tool, concretely speaking, 2 weeks ago in Cairo, and we had gathered more than 160 representatives, but we had 250 B2Bs that were facilitating through the business country desk platform among more than 90 participants from companies, SMEs, startups, and business incubators from 13 countries of the Euro-Mediterranean region. For the near future, we are planning to have also 2 regional events coming with Mashreq and Maghreb countries, and one in Tunis in next March with UNIDO and Union for the Mediterranean for women entrepreneurs. And the next one will be in Amman for UNIDO. It will be in May, using, of course, the business country desk tool. So the goal of using this tool is having a unique platform, which is free, and gathering all stakeholders, and particularly companies, apart from regulation, apart from agreement, apart from legal framework, of course, that we are having in our countries with the different tempos from Europe and South Mediterranean countries, to have this unique platform to do business, to do trade, internationalization, and be digital. And of course, not forgetting that we also insist on having the component of social dialogue to raise our voice to the government in order to help us and help particularly the private sector having better regulation and legal framework for trade. And we have no other choice than following the moves with the digital new generation and the digital jobs that will be created in the future. So if you have any question about the tools, we will share the link on the chat, and do not hesitate. Thank you, Amadou, for giving us this chance, and thank you also, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Jeanne. I had the chance to experience, to test this platform, and I can testify that it's an extremely useful platform. And all our speakers today emphasize the importance of cooperation. So this platform is a concrete example of how international stakeholders can come together, can connect, and can collaborate. So it's definitely something very concrete. We have a question. We have a question here. So we will start with this first question. After, I will give the floor to Roberto, who also has a question. And the question that I will ask is from Farouk. It's for Farouk, an IOE member from Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken. So the question is for all the speakers. I will read it. The massive industrialization in the 19th and 20th century has contributed towards environment pollution and climate change, for which the human race is paying the price now. Working in digital environments with electromagnetic signals all around, how far will be detrimental to human health in few decades from now? Any idea or research on that? Of course, industrialization and digitalization have created enough wealth and opportunities, no doubt. But at what cost? Any visualization? So the floor is open to all the speakers on the consequences on the human health, the consequences of digitalization.
There's another question.
Maybe ITU would like maybe to answer to this question, or any speaker would like to, please, if you'd like to share your thought on this. Okay, so I'll give you some.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is Manuela speaking.
Yes, Manuela, please.
Yes, well, I'm not an expert in this domain, far from it, but I think that digitalization, like any other technological change that may be introduced into production processes, organization of work, etc., may entail, of course, some risks for the health of the people concerned. There is no doubt about it. But this does not necessarily mean that we should refrain from relying on digitalization because of such potential risks. I think that the issue is indeed to have in place systems that allow for monitoring what might be the impacts, the extent of such impacts, and with a view to taking measures to mitigate the possible potential risk or eliminate them altogether. I mean, the ILO, we have quite a number of instruments that are dealing with occupational safety and health that also deal with issues relating to radiation, for instance, that provide some useful guiding principles in terms of indeed how to prevent, address, and mitigate such risks. Over.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tomei, for this answer.
I might just jump into the thought from a business perspective. And g'day, Farouk, and I hope you're well. And I hope you're having a great time, and thanks for listening in. I'll work on the basis that governments, and I'm interested in the ITUC's view on issues associated with health, any health aspects of radiation. But if you think overall about the health impacts of digital, they're overwhelmingly positive, as a matter of fact, not just from a climate change perspective, but also from the idea of bringing prosperity. Because if you think about how can you make a population more healthy, well, you make them more prosperous. That's the number one way of doing that, because they can then pay for the health services and the infrastructure and so on that enables them to have those outcomes. So overwhelmingly, when I look at digital, I look at the capacity for those countries that are least developed and developing to improve their lot and to improve the health of their citizenry. The second point is when you think particularly about issues like climate change and other things, we often jump to digital replacing existing activities. For example, I'm in New Zealand tonight. I could have flown up for some sort of in-person thing to talk about this, and it would have cost an awful lot of air miles and so on. And people often jump to that to say, gosh, isn't this great? And isn't this great for the environment? And no doubt it is. But I also think about digital as a much more powerful tool around things like reporting, about things like, as I said in my presentation, stopping corruption and so on. And all of these things matter a great deal, not just to climate change, but also to the way in which communities can prosper and thrive. So sure, there might be some health issues from time to time associated with digital, but overall, the growth of digital is a massive benefit to the world, and we should work on that basis. And if it's done well, it's a particular benefit to the least prosperous among us, and we should support its growth on that basis, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Reilly, for your contribution. Last intervention on this point from Mrs. Boutiba.
Yes, just an information, Amadou, because as we saw after the COVID, I mean, both are going together. Digitalization, we have no other choice. And we saw also that the climate change is so important. So as a social partner, we work a lot on these topics, and we involved toward the green, digital, and resilient economy. So we have no other choice than working on both sides. It's not, we cannot say that digital is, making electromagnetic signals that ruining the planet and working on climate change. This is not only the only cause, but we have to work on both of them from the top in terms of policy and reforms, and also to have, to implement these actions through this population in order to raise awareness about what is changing in these countries in terms of climate changes and what we can do in terms of green, blue economy, and that also impact jobs and will also impact jobs in terms of digitalization. So what we can say, it's a balance. Both of them are important, and we need them both for resilient economies.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Boutiba. Mrs. Abdullah, you would like to intervene on this question?
Just very quickly, Amadou, thank you.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add my comments to what the other panelists have said. And that is, vis-a-vis electromagnetic signals and EMC, the ITU generally leaves that to the WHO. We work with them on that, and the WHO does do some work on that, I believe. On the climate change and green, we are trying to work towards a net zero industry that ITU is involved in. And we are also doing some work on e-waste. I thought that would be of interest because this sector generates a lot of waste. And if you think about it, it's all e-waste. The more digitalized we become, the more devices we have. And it's not just consumer devices, but it's also commercial devices. All that equipment that is used to generate the internet, that powers the internet, that's to be looked at as well. And all that is looked after under an e-waste program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Abdullah. I will now give the floor to Roberto, who has a question also.
Well, I had, yes. I had a question for you, but may I also make a comment regarding health and digitalization? And I suppose also that was in line with what Manuela was saying is, I am a firm believer, and we are firm believers of the digital era as an era of opportunities, of big opportunities. So let's also be very sincere among ourselves. There is some challenges in terms of the way we work and in the way we do business. Okay, and if you pay attention on how our minds, just our minds, are transforming the way we operate with digital tools, you will see in the middle and long term the consequence, also the way we learn. Okay, so there is some important health challenges which goes beyond the radiomagnetics. I mean, it has to do also with the capacity to pay attention to to things. I mean, that are going to, you know, have important consequences also at the workplace. I just want to raise this point because it's not minor at all. It's not at all minor. I have a question perhaps to Sulina, to Miho, and Manuela. And Yihen and Phil, you apologize if I don't address you on this. I mean, to what extent the digital era can help bring individuals and business out of informality? I mean, there are two sides of that, isn't it? When I give you a very typical topical, and forgive me for being topical on this example, and I mentioned one company, and I don't have a problem to mention it because we work with them very often. It's Uber. When you go to a big town like Mexico, DF, or even Johannesburg, normally when you use Uber, to some extent you feel safer than using a normal taxi. I'm just telling it from a practical perspective. Why? Because this person is tracked. And that goes to the point that Phil was already saying. I mean, the capacity of a digital tools to track and to get, you know, a kind of rating of satisfaction, etc., can leverage some opportunities in terms of formalization, or not, or we are totally wrong. We have been looking at innovative ways of bringing individuals out of informality, and that's critical also to push for a productivity agenda, also for labor rights, Manuela, I think. And I wonder whether you have any reflection to give us on this.
Yes, thank you for that comment and question. Certainly, there is no doubt about the fact that digitalization, by making it much easier to trace any transaction which happens on the market, may contribute in significant ways to the formalization of these transactions and economic activities. So there is huge potential in that, which also means that there is a possibility not only to, by formalizing economic activities, to expand what might be the basis for taxation purposes, for fiscal revenues, but it also allowed to determine, in the case of workers, in the case of dependent workers in particular, whether their social security contributions or other benefits that they may be entitled to can actually be paid. So I think we need to look at the potential benefits of digitalization also from the viewpoint of how it can help in terms of reducing the prevalence of informality. But for that to happen, there should be some willingness from those who indeed have control over the data to make those data accessible with a view to informing, relevant public policies as well as, including social protection policies. Over.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tomei. Mrs. Abdullah, you would like to react?
Yes. I was going to say that I mentioned just now, and if you recall the wheel that I presented about access, which is communication access. And once that's there, you have to bring them online, and that's adoption. And then there's value creation. So the value creation part really is about bringing people into the formal economy, so that all those who have been in the informal part of it, if you'd like, will be able to find a way and reap the benefits of digital. There's identity, there's digital identity, and there's the tracing, and there's know your customer, you know, so that there's all this that we can actually, or communities can actually depend upon in order to get into the formal economy. And that's what it's all about. Value creation is exactly that, creating value out of the digitalization. That's just a very short answer.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Abdullah.
Mrs. Miho.
Mrs. Miho,
yes,
would you like
thank
to intervene on this one?
I'm really sort of complimentary to the very good points that were raised by previous speakers. I just want to share some experience and sort of the issue that we are assessing here in UNCTAD linked to the creative economy. Digitalization obviously brought all these economic actors close to the market, because now they can really define this geographical distance and so on and so forth. And especially when you are selling intangibles, right? The creative economy designs, ideas, and so on and so forth. So that is very, very good. But we actually see that, like, you know, what Madam Abdallah was saying, this value creation is very, very important. But we do require some kind of a safety net to ensure that these actors can really create values. One is, of course, what is their access and capacity to reach these digital services, like I mentioned, financial services, communication services. All this has become an important infrastructure and a requirement to participate in value creation. That's one thing. Another thing, especially important in the creative economy, is the area of intellectual property right. Within the country, national level, if there's a kind of the institutional framework to guarantee that you can really have your intellectual property right to your ideas, to these intangibles. But it is something that can be solved within the national, but now we are talking about international trade, because if you're connected to internet, you can really exchange these things across the board, right? How do we deal with this intellectual property issue on the creative economy, on the digital platform? This is something that's quite new. And this is something that absolutely area that this multi-stakeholder participation, collaboration, cooperation is important. Government, private sector, and international agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Shorter. Mrs. Abdullah, would you like to react again?
Yes, I would.
Okay, please.
If that's all right with you.
Yes.
I think that's a really important point. And what all the panelists have been saying really puts paid to what we were saying just now, that collaborative regulation is the way to go, because it's not just one regulator who's in charge of digital in a particular within your borders. It's everybody. Somebody who's selling pesticides online, that hits 2 or 3 other agencies, you know, so it's not just the agency that's looking after your identity or the security and integrity of the networks, but the payments and everything else. Now, I think, Phil, you mentioned just now about fit for purpose and everything having to be fit for purpose. ITU has begun to realize, and we are working towards this in our new vision, that we need to be fit for the future. So we're going one step further. Instead of being just fit for purpose, we need everything to be fit for future, because in the digital space, there are the known knowns. There are also the known unknowns. The metaverse, for instance, is very new. So we don't know yet what's going to happen, but we know there's the metaverse. And the third bit is the unknown unknowns. And the digital space and the internet has proven that we only know so much about it today, and there's so much more potential for it either to shine or it could go south. Either way, regulators in every sector have to be prepared for this. And that's why we believe in Fit for Future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Roberto. There is a question.
There are 2 questions, in fact. One is, if I may say, Amadou. One is from, let me just go. Yes, one is from Adebola Akiwandi, which has to do with the role of IOE, and I will answer in the closing remarks if you don't mind. And there is another one from Jose Luis Vivero, who has to do with the blockchains and the distributed ledger technology in general, and the central bank digital currency to tackle the informal economy. I would say, I don't know whether anyone wants to make a remark because we are running out of time, but I think it's an important point. We could dedicate one specific forum just to that. I mean, how blockchain technology can change also the way we do e-commerce and the digital economy. But also, I think the question is more related to the barriers of the government. Is there any point you want to make on that quickly before we go to the closing, and then I answer the question by Abebola in the closing part? Sulina, you wanted to say something, but we cannot hear you because you are muted.
Thank you. I was reading the question, and I think I will answer that part of it. I think it all boils down to what is preventing governments from investing in digital infrastructure. It's not so much about governments investing or not investing in digital infrastructure. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. So governments can't do this on their own. And from about 10 to 15, maybe 20 years ago, governments have divested themselves from infrastructure, from owning infrastructure. And what they do now is they pave the way for infrastructure. So creating that conducive environment will bring in the investments to create, that digital environment that you need. I hope that answers your question, because that's a very important point, that no government can do this alone. They need their stakeholders around them. And that's why the ITU has got 1,000 members who are from the private sector, the academia, civil society, and other international organizations. And we work with all of them and across borders too. So it's not just working within your borders, but you have to work across borders. The internet is borderless. And what governments try to do is they try to put artificial borders in space to protect their consumers, and it doesn't work. So we've got to find a way to do this.
This is a relevant follow-up point, because I think that's the main challenge, isn't it? We have global challenges, but we don't have global answers, because we are still with our limited borders trying to solve trends and problems that are becoming more and more global. And even if we are talking about now a new trend towards protectionism, at the end of the day, this other trend, which has to do also with digitalization, which is cross-border, is there, and it's very difficult to stop it. And that's where the IOE wants to help, okay? And you are already liaising each other within the different UN agencies. But what we want, I think, Sulina, you referred to three things. One is awareness. I mean, we should not underestimate how important is our advocacy role within the business community, but also at policy level, internationally, but also national, to strengthen the awareness of leveraging the digital reality or digital trend. That's not yet there. The same for affordability. I mean, the digital divide is a growing strong divide. And we as business, we have a responsibility also to push an agenda which shorten this division, as Phil said, at the end of the day, that's going to create much more opportunities. Of course, with some caveats, as Manuela also were referred, because it's not automatic. It's far away from being automatic. There are many, important elements which have to do with abuses, and we have to recognize that there are abuses in existing regulations, sometimes national, but sometimes international regulations through the digital means. We are obsessed with the skills in IOE, and I'm personally obsessed with the skills. This is a strong follow-up action from our side with all of you. I mean, what the mapping of skills, and also has to do with the climate change, green skills, whatever we call them. What is the support that countries need also to get there in terms of digital skills? We are already working in an important project, by the way, in Africa with Microsoft. Amadou is very, very much involved in it. But also there are many other elements, but I will identify this awareness, affordability, skills, not losing mind of something that you have said, that the more digital we are, to some extent and contradictory, the more fragile we are also. And that's quite tricky. In one sense, we can be much more efficient. We can have more opportunities. We can go cross-border. We have more startups. The number of startups has increased. But on the other side, we have to realize that there's some vulnerabilities linked to data protection, linked to fragile technology, infrastructure, etc., that has been already raised. We're going to produce a report out of that, a small report of this meeting, which will help us to navigate. But I want to thank you, all of you, for this excellent exchange. And we look forward also to see you physically, please, next time. I think that would be better. And thank you special to our friends joining from Asia or Americas, because that's a big effort from your side. Phil, especially for you. Thank you so much.
So, thank you very much, Roberto. So here come the ends of this conference. I want to thank our speakers for the successful and productive conference we just had. I have to admit that I was impressed by the high level of engagement and thoughtful contribution from each of you. So your valuable insights and perspective on these topics we discussed made for a truly enriching experience. So I'm confident that our discussion will lead to positive outcomes and action as a report, as Roberto mentioned. So I would like to extend my appreciation to the technical team, Marina Wibush and Emily Villet, who ensured that the conference ran smoothly, and to all the participants who made time in their busy schedules to join us today. Once again, thank you for your active participation. I look forward for future opportunities to work together and continue this conversation. Thank you, Red.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.